Chag Sameach. This is David Glickman. I'm the rabbi at Congregation Beth Shalom. Thank you so much for joining me for this short teaching on motivation by fear of God. Before I begin, I just want to thank the Rabbinical Assembly and their leadership in putting together this really tremendous project. This is such a point of collaboration, and it draws the Jewish people together, and it draws the rabbis of our movement together, and hopefully it's drawing communities and congregations together. I want to talk today about the idea of fear of God. This is a topic, and this is a phrase that we as Jews don't use very often. We hear non-Jews speaking about it sometimes, but it's usually not a factor. I rarely, as a rabbi, I don't think I've ever actually invoked fear of God as a reason for studying Torah, as a reason for doing mitzvot, as a reason for doing anything spiritual or religious in one's life. And yet, this is a term that we use in English a lot, a God-fearing individual, to describe a pious person. And what we're going to look at today are a few texts that explore this phrase, fear of God, and contrasts it with love of God. But I'm going to try to show us a different way of thinking about it. When I think of fear of God without diving deeply into these texts, I think of someone who is afraid of punishment, that God is going to somehow pick someone out of the crowd, strike them down with lightning, give them something horrible in their life because of something that they have done. This is, of course, trying to discern the will of God, which is very hard to do, and something that I don't even try to do. But it is very much a practice, and I think it's a particularly dangerous one at this time, to try to discern out why God does punishments. And during this time of pandemic, I think it can be heartless to do, because in some sense we will be blaming the very victims and the people who need our help the most. And so what this lesson is going to try to do is to try to explore a different way of thinking about fear of God that I think will be very empowering, and I think it will give us something to think about, and I think is very relevant for this time. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to share the text sheet that I've also attached and given to the Rabbinical Assembly. That's a PDF that you can download. The character who's the antithesis of God-fearing is the character of Amalek. Amalek and his army, the Amalekites, his nation, attack Bnei Israel when they are traveling through the desert. We first see his name mentioned in the book of Exodus, and then it is remembered in the book of Deuteronomy and Devarim during Parshat Zachor. This is the Parsha, the Shabbat that takes place right before Purim. And of course, the reason why we read it on that special Shabbat is because the arch enemy of the Jewish people in the story of Purim, Haman, he is a descendant of Amalek. And we will see that he is described as not having fear of God. We see this in text 2. Text 1, which I'm not going to jump into, gives you the time when we first see Amalek during his attacks in the book of Exodus. But in remembering these attacks, this is what the Torah says. It says, "Asher korchecha baderech, vayinei bechad, et kol hanechashalim acharecha, v'yata ayef v'yagea, v'lo yara Elohim." How undeterred by fear of God, he, meaning Amalek, surprised you on the march, when you were famished and when you were weary, and he cut down all the stragglers in your rear. Rashi comments on this. What does this mean that they were ayef v'yagea? They were faint through thirst. And he quotes the verse about how the people thirsted for more water. And then immediately afterwards in Bamidbar, it says, then came Amalek. So it was precisely at the weakest moment. And what does this mean that he feared not God? Rashi says on Deuteronomy, Amalek did not fear God, which means that he did not refrain from harming you. In other words, he had absolutely no limit to his cruelty. He went after the weakest, He went after the most tired. He went after the stragglers in our rear. The basis of morality, in my opinion, is to be unlike Amalek. In other words, to fear God is to protect the least powerful, to go to the back of the herd and protect those who might be straggling, protect those who might be tired. When we think of fear of God, we think that it is in some way maybe the opposite of love of God. But we're going to see that these two ideas are actually somewhat related. Let's look at the Mishnah Torah, at Rambam's famous teaching of legal codes. He says, the worshiper, because of love, engages himself in the study of the Torah. I'm on text number 5. And the observance of precepts, and follows the path of wisdom on no account in the world, neither for fear of evil, nor to inherit the good, but he does the true thing because it is true. And in the end, the good comes thereof. That degree is a great degree, indeed, and not every scholar attains it. For this was the degree of Abraham Avinu, Abraham our father, whom the Holy One, blessed be he, called his beloved, because he, Abraham, worshipped not except for love. And it is furthermore the degree concerning which the Holy One, blessed be he, commanded through Moses, saying, and you shall love the Lord your God, v'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha. For when a man will love God with a proper love, that person will momentarily perform all the commandments because of love. So Rambam says we shouldn't do mitzvot out of fear. We should do it out of love. We love God so much. We want to be close to God. We want to be like Avraham Avinu. We want to be like Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher, and we want to get close to God. And just like the people in our life that we love, we want to do things that please them. And so when we do mitzvot, and when we live a life filled with Torah, when we live a life filled with chesed, with loving kindness, we are doing it out of love of God, and we are doing it because we know that God loves those actions. But Rambam also says that we need to do both. He says in the Foundations of the Torah, in one of the first chapters of his Mishneh Torah, he says that it is obligatory to both love and fear the glorified and awe-inspiring God, because it says both, you shall love the Lord your God, and it also says, et Hashem Elokecha tira, you will fear the Lord your God. So we need to find ways of worshiping God both out of love and out of fear. And the Mesilat Yesharim, which is an 18th century Musar text, a teaching about ethical living, tries to go through the different elements of fear. The first is what I had just mentioned, fearing God that something terrible will happen to us. If I put on tefillin every day, I won't get hit by a car as I'm crossing the street. You know, that type of theology. A lot of people have this type of theology. That's not my theology personally, but many people do have it. And it is really the lowest form of fear. But there is another kind of fear that the Mesilat Yesharim points out in number 6, which is called Urahara Mahmood, which is a fear of God in God's exalted nature. And in a sense, it's almost a type of intimidation that God is so great that how could God even care about me? And this is what he says. He says the second type of fear is fear of God's exaltedness, Urahara Mahmood. It means that a person distances and refrains from sin because of God's great honor. Blessed be God's name. For how could his heart of flesh and blood, lowly and pity, allow or dare to do something against the will of the Creator? Blessed and exalted be God's name. So what the Ramchal in Mesilat Yesharim is trying to say is that in a sense, we become so in awe of God and God's holiness that we are we stop ourselves from doing anything that would in any way separate us. We are afraid of being separated from God in God's exaltedness. And the Ramchal recognizes that this is a very difficult level to attain in one's own personal spiritual practice and in one's own piety. And I'm not going to go through this entire text, but I would encourage you, if you are learning on your own tonight, or if you're learning with friends or family tonight, maybe you're having a driveway tikkun with social distancing with neighbors, maybe you are having a dining room tikkun with your family, I would really encourage you to go through each of these points and discuss and say, how do you or how have you experienced these types of fears? And maybe you haven't experienced it with fear of God. Maybe you've experienced with fear of man. Maybe you've experienced it with fear of other human beings. Maybe it's a fear of your parents. Maybe it's a fear of your spouse. Not that you're worried, God forbid, that your parents are going to hit you or ground you. Not that your spouse, God forbid, is going to walk out on you. But rather, sometimes we have a fear of people who we love, and it's more of a fear of disappointment or a fear that I am not living up to the expectations that other person in my life, or I am afraid that I am not being the best partner, the best spouse, the best child, the best parent that I can be. That is a real fear. And for me, anyway, that fear of not living up to my own internal expectations of myself based on the loving relationship that I have with another is the human analog to this Urahara Mahmood, this fear of the exaltedness of God. And I know that my spouse loves me. I know that my parents love me. I know that my kids love me. And out of that love, I desire to be the best person that I can be. And I fear that I sometimes don't live up to those expectations that I have for myself. So now I'm going to give us a different way of looking at fear. And this is the characters of Shifra and Puah. And the characters of Shifra and Puah are the Hebrew midwives. Now, these are two of my favorite characters in the entire Torah and the entire Tanakh. They are exceedingly brave. They really are responsible for the saving of the Jewish people pre-Exodus. And I think that they are inspiring women, and I try to imagine the courage that they had. And I want to show you a very interesting Hebrew phrase. Okay, the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shifra and the other Puah, saying, whenever you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it is a boy, kill him. And if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, fearing God, did not do as the king of Egypt had told them, and they let the boys live. Now, there is a question about who these midwives are. Rashi, in his comment, I'm not going to go through all of Rashi's comments. You can go through that on your own. It's text number 9. But Rashi brings up the very traditional midrash that Shifra was Yocheved, Moses' mother, and Puah was Miriam, Moses' sister. And in a sense, these are different names that they used, maybe in Egyptian society, or maybe they had nicknames, or maybe it was their title as midwives. But this is who they were: Moses' mom and Moses' sister. And they were doing all these surreptitious clandestine births. But if we look closely at the Hebrew, it is not so clear that these Hebrew midwives were, in fact, Hebrews. They are miyaldot ha'ivriot. They were the midwives that are Hebrews, or they are midwives to the Hebrews. Because the way that Hebrew works you can have two noun phrases, like, and they have funny rules for its plural forms and its singular forms. It's kind of like secretaries of state, attorneys general that we have in English. And so the question comes in when it says miyaldot, midwives, ha'ivriot, Hebrew? Is the word ivriot, Hebrew, describing the midwives? Or is the ivriot, the feminine plural of Hebrew, describing the women to whom the midwives were attending to? So are they the Hebrew midwives, or are they midwives to the Hebrews? And the Seforno says that no, they were Egyptians. They were the midwives. They were resident in the capital, and it was obviously impossible, he says, for such a large number of people residing in so many parts of Egypt to all be serviced by only 2 midwives. So these were the midwives that were assigned to the Hebrews. However, after the midwives in the capital, though Egyptian, the Sforno says, betrayed the instructions by their king and explained to their king why they had done so, the king did not bother to rely on midwives anywhere else either, and the scheme was abandoned. So in other words, they could only serve for a short time, but they were Egyptian midwives. I want to share with you actually a Devar Torah that my daughter told us at our Seder table this year when we were discussing the midwives at our Seder table. And she said, actually, if these 2 women were such brave heroines, it makes most sense to say that they were Egyptians. Because why would the Torah need to specify that they feared God if the Torah assumed that they were Israelites? Wouldn't the Torah make an assumption that all of Bnei Israel feared God? Isn't that what we do? We are a God-fearing people. We are Yirei Hashem. And so the Torah would want to point out that they were Egyptians, and not only that, it makes them even more heroic because they are Egyptians who are supposed to be loyal to Pharaoh, supposed to be loyal to the king, and yet they are helping the most persecuted people in the kingdom, the Hebrew women. And she said that this is what makes them heroic. In other words, they are the mirror image of Amalek. They are the ones who are protecting the weakest amongst us. I think of this particularly now during this time of COVID-19, when there is unprecedented opportunities to feel helpless and feel that we can't do anything, and there are unprecedented opportunities to help people. And both the amount of good that we can do in reaching out to people, in assisting people, in giving to people is overwhelming. It's overwhelming in the capacity that we have to positively impact people. The amount of people who need help even beyond what we can do and beyond what our capacity to do is also staggering. And I am really appreciative of this teaching about the Egyptian midwives, because what it's saying is that to fear God is not to fear that God will smite me, heaven forfend, with a plague, with a disease, with an illness, with misfortune. But rather to fear God is to take a risk and look out for those most vulnerable and to do what needs to be done to save them. I want to close with 2 short teachings from the Hasidic tradition. The first is from Rav Aaron of Karlin. Rav Aaron of Karlin was was in the court of the Maggid of Mezerich, and he used to faint on Rosh Hashanah when he came to Hamelech. And this is at the beginning of Shacharit, and we hear the cantor, the chazan, singing in beautiful, beautiful tones, Hamelech. And he would faint, and they say, why are you fainting? And the answer that Rav Aaron gave is this quote from the Talmud about when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai comes to the Emperor Vespasian as the temple is being destroyed, as Jerusalem is in pieces. Vespasian says to him, "If I am a king, why didn't you come to me until now?" And this phrase, though coming out of the mouth of a Roman emperor and directed towards the great Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, is heard by Rav Aaron hundreds, thousands of years later, is not being spoken to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, but speaking to him. That here on Rosh Hashanah, as he's standing before God, God is saying to him, "If I am a king, why didn't you come to me before now?" And I think that this is also a kind of a fear that we've missed out on closeness to God. We've missed out on intimacy with God. And if God is truly a king, why would we approach to God before this time? And this is a type of humility that we all can have in our praying. And a final teaching from Rav Zusia in Martin Buber's Tales of the Hasidim. He used to pray so much, I'm just going to paraphrase this, that he prayed that he would have the fear of God like the angels fear God. He's praying so hard, Rabbi Shalom, Master of the universe, please give me the fear of God like the angels have fear of God. God hears his prayer and poof, gives to him the fear that the angels do. Zusia doesn't become like an angel. Instead, he becomes like a cowering dog. He hides under his bed and he says, Rabboni Shalom, Master of the universe, please just let me love you like Zusia again. And God heard him this time also. Why I love this, this teaching is I think it is a teaching of empowerment, that we have the ability to love God and we have the ability to fear God in our own way. We don't need to be like angels. We don't need to be the pious person that we may have in our imagination. We can be ourselves. But our guidebook for how we fear God and how we live a life of fearing God is mapped out for us in the Torah. We cannot be like Amalek. We need to be like Shifra and Puah. We need to find those who are most vulnerable. And even when it puts ourselves and our own lives at danger, we can try to help them. And we can try to look out for them. And we can try to protect them. And this, perhaps, is what it means to have this Urahara Mahmood, this fear of the exaltedness of God, of living up to the godly expectations that we have for ourselves and that our Creator has for us, both as individuals and collectively. I'm going to take myself off share screen. I just want to thank you for joining me tonight. I hope that you are having a wonderful and inspiring night of learning and of teaching one another, and that you have a wonderful, joyful Shavuot. And if you are one of my current or former congregants, I look forward to hearing from you. And if you're not, I look forward to connecting with you at some point and hopefully for good things. Chag Sameach. And again, thank you to the Rabbinical Assembly for putting this together.